for that intro. Yeah, that's correct. I did a lot of different things in my PhD, and today I will be talking about the research that constituted the first chapter of my PhD thesis, which was together with a few other members of the Conservation Forensics Lab, including my supervisor, Dr. Caroline Dingle, looking at a global legal wildlife trade system that includes both CITES and non-CITES listed species, and highlighting areas where we can help improve detection of species overexploitation. So legal wildlife trade, if it's not properly monitored and regulated, can have multiple negative effects. So as this map here illustrates, even the exotic pet trade, which is what this map is concerning, involves multiple different taxa as well as many different countries and really connects us all. And what I'll be talking about today involves many different species, including everything from seafood to timber used as furniture to ornaments and jewelry and many different wildlife. So again, if this trade is not properly monitored, it can have myriad effects, such as we've learned from the past year and a half, it can facilitate the transfer of zoonotic diseases and the outbreak of pandemics, which has many impacts, profound impacts on human society. If we don't have a precise knowledge of wildlife that is traded legally, it can be unsustainable and biodiversity can be depleted. And this in turn can impair the ability of local people and communities to benefit from the natural resources in their area through sustainable trade and sustainable farming initiatives. Because you really need precise information and monitoring and regulation and specific context for this to be successful. And if wildlife resources are depleted, we as a society are also deprived of the ecosystem services that they provide. So there are two major systems in place for tracking legal wildlife trade. One of them is the Convention in International Trade of Endangered Species and Flora and Fauna, or CITES, which lists around 36,000 species that have already been considered to be threatened. So 36,000 sounds like quite a lot, but there are estimated to be around 8 million species in existence on our planet, 2 million around of which have been described. And so obviously many thousands of species that are traded are not included in CITES. Actually, CITES doesn't list many songbirds, fish, trees, or plants, for example, that are often commonly traded as exotic pets, food, furniture, or traditional medicine. To get an idea of volumes and numbers and values of trade in these, you have to look at the UN Comtrade database, which is a centralized database for all the UN member states to report trade in all different commodities, everything from agricultural products to technology and car tires and coffee and anything, including also wildlife. So in academic literature, there has been a heavy focus on analyzing the CITES trade database, because CITES has species level information. It makes it easier to look at global trends in specific species and taxa. However, as I mentioned, the CITES trade database is really just a subset of species that are traded globally. So this provides an incomplete picture of wildlife trade in reality. And there have been other research papers coming up that indicate the various limitations and challenges involved in analyzing CITES data. These include inconsistent reporting practices across the convention signatories. So there might be different standards and procedures that lead to inconsistencies in the data. There are multiple unstandardized measurements unit used. So everything from boxes to feathers to individuals and so on. There's also no value declarations included in the data that you can download from the CITES trade database. And sometimes, although species are listed on CITES individually, the reporting will only include family or genus classification, not the species level info. And as I mentioned, they only include threatened species, not other species that are traded that are not listed on CITES. The Comtrade database, in contrast, does require all UN member states to report annually, follows the centralized system, and includes US dollar values, which are reported by all the member states, as well as more homogeneous descriptions of the units, so individuals or whatever it might be, kilograms. So this, and since it includes both CITES and non-CITES listed species, it constitutes the most comprehensive database in existence on legally traded wildlife. However, it doesn't often have species level information, which is a bit of a problem. So you might ask, okay, well, if a species is commonly traded, why do we need species level information actually? Well, if you don't have precise knowledge or data on the number of individuals or the value or where it geographically a species is coming from, then you can't track trade and detect if something's being overexploited or traded unsustainably. An example to illustrate this is the Oriental magpie robin, which the Dingle Lab has seen and documented is a very commonly traded songbird in Hong Kong and elsewhere. In Hong Kong, in the bird market surveys we've been doing every month, there's been about 150 individuals for sale each time, and they're usually displayed like this in multiple rows of cages. So you would think, okay, well, they're fine, they're doing well. However, they have become extremely rare in parts of their range in Indonesia and Malaysia. And kind of indicating the fact that they are being overexploited in those regions, but they're not yet CITES listed. So there's no reliable international data on the numbers that are being traded in between countries. And this scenario has been documented by Frank and Will Cove in this paper, and it applies to many traded taxa. Basically, they're being overexploited, but there's no data to alert people to this before it gets to a critical point, at which time regulation and classifications as threatened and so on kind of catch up in a retroactive action. And it would be better if we were able to catch this earlier. Having precise knowledge on legal trade also illuminates aspects of the illegal trade, because they often actually have a relationship. The distinction isn't as black and white as people might think. So the legal trade often provides cover for and trade flows for the illegal trade, and trade flows are all often correlated as well. So this traffic report recently released showed that almost 27,000 Oriental magpie robins were seized in the last 6 years or so by customs in Indonesia and Malaysia, indicating that there's an parallel illegal trade going on. And the existence of this unregulated legal trade in Oriental magpie robins provides a market for which to launder these illegally procured wildlife into. So myself and the co-authors on this paper and research wanted to look at analyze the trade in general wildlife, not just CITES, since most research attention had been concentrated on this area to date. This was recently published in an open access journal, so you can all go and have a read if you want. And our objective was to quantify global patterns in all traded wildlife and derivatives, as well. Oh, and the method that we used for this was downloading 20 years of data from the UN CompTrade database, which is publicly available online, in 347 codes that we consider to include wildlife or wildlife derivatives. So to do this, we had to define wildlife. And that initially we did that by excluding codes for heavily domesticated livestock or animals. And ideally, we would have also liked to completely exclude any farm-sourced wildlife animals as well. However, a limitation of the CompTrade system is that the codes it uses, the HS codes, are designed for statistics and taxation purposes primarily, not really the ecological considerations that we examine here. So the codes do not separate wild and farmed animals. For example, other tropical wood is a code that includes both tropical wood that has been sourced from plantations as well as from deforested forests. Other live fish has both fish from industrial commercial fisheries as well as aquaculture. So we didn't want to exclude these codes because it would mean excluding huge swathes of wild sourced animals. And another reason for including these codes is that farms actually have negative impacts on wild populations. So in the same way that illegal and legal wildlife trade is related to each other, farming and wild populations of the same species can have impacts and a relationship. Farms also provide an avenue for laundering of poached animals. So there's research showing, for example, in Russia that fur-bearing species are poached and then integrated into the mass commercial farming system that there is there for fur species. Farms can stimulate parallel illegal trade. The farms for tigers, for example, in China and Vietnam have been shown to stimulate illegal trade in wild tigers because it's seen as a more high quality product. And farms can provide individuals that are escapees that get into the wild populations and deplete the genetic integrity of those wild populations. So once we had downloaded all the 347 codes for 20 years, we separated these into different subsets so we could analyze different aspects and trade flows. These included a subset of broad codes that specified taxonomic class and above, specific codes of order and below, processed codes that include wildlife that has gone through some sort of processing, and a code for raw wildlife products, which are more primary products. Our results showed that between 1997 and 2016, wildlife trade averaged $220 billion per year, which is around twice the global trade in tea, coffee, and spices. It's also orders of magnitude greater than the estimated value of illegal trade in wildlife. We separated these codes into 8 wildlife trade categories that you can see on the right here. And as you can see, the majority of legal wildlife trade in this period involved seafood. 82% of it was in seafood. And followed by fashion, which is furs and reptile hides, furniture, which is mainly timber, traditional medicine, wild meat, exotic pets, exhibition, and that sort of zoos, entertainment, and racing wildlife, and then ornaments and jewelry. In seafood, the top traders were also the biggest economies globally: US, China, and Japan. And on this map, you can see the top importers and exporters for the other, well, all the categories that we examined. So you can see, in similarity with the first map that I showed, it really involves a broad range of taxa and many different countries, especially considering this is just the top 3 of each. And you can see that Hong Kong, for a relatively small territory, has a large role in the fashion industry, wildlife fashion, as well as traditional medicine. If we combine imports and exports, these are the top 20 wildlife trading nations over the course of the period. And those top 10, the top 10 here in the yellow box, actually account for over half of the total value of wildlife traded. We wanted to look at the role of transit hubs specifically, because they have a role as a sort of concentration point for wildlife trade globally. And that's a strategically important area to focus any enforcement efforts or monitoring, because it would have the greatest impact on monitoring global wildlife trade compared to the investment of your resources. So we did that by examining the role of these territories and countries in wildlife trade compared to their GDP ranking globally. So the GDP ranking, you can see on the number on the gray bars here. And you might notice that in the top 10, Hong Kong has the lowest GDP ranking, but is still a relatively big player in wildlife trade. So this means that it's not producing the products domestically that it's exporting. It's actually importing them and then re-exporting them and functioning as a processing or transit hub. This is also indicated for Hong Kong specifically in illegal wildlife trade. This report by ADM Capital Foundation, which analyzed customs seizures, showed that Hong Kong functions as a transit point for illegal exotic pet trade, ivory trade, and timber trade, among others. So again, that illustrates the relationship between legal and illegal wildlife trade flows and how they can correlate. To look into this further, we examined our processed data set, and we found that these 5 countries were the ones that traded in processed wildlife the most. And I've underlined Thailand and Vietnam because if we go back to the previous slide, we can see that also these 2 countries have a relatively low GDP ranking compared to their involvement in the global legal wildlife trade. So these areas act as a funnel for global wildlife trade, where it kind of becomes concentrated. And this is illustrated by Hong Kong's role in the wildlife fashion industry, where it's the #1 importer and exporter simultaneously, where with 20% of global wildlife fashion imports and 30% of global wildlife fashion exports passing through this small territory. So if we were to monitor thoroughly the trade in wildlife fashion coming through Hong Kong, what species it involved, where it was coming from, where it was going, that would give us an idea of 50% of the global trade in wildlife fashion. The pivotal role of this small territory also becomes apparent when you remove seafood from the analysis. Hong Kong actually becomes the #1 wildlife trader globally, eclipsing both China, USA, and many other much larger economies, which is quite amazing, really. Another aspect that we wanted to look into was the broad code subset that we made, because to see how often these broad codes only describing taxonomic class and above were being used. Actually, 34% of the trade during this period in wildlife was declared only to taxonomic class and above. So you can see in this kind of ugly table, I apologize, but I will break it down, that 23% of seafood, for example, was declared simply as fish. 24% of furniture in the furniture category of trade was declared just as tropical wood. And in the fashion category, 26% of wildlife trade was declared just as other furs. So if you declare trade under these broad categories, it makes it very difficult or impossible to know what amount of each species was being traded, and if they were coming from certain protected areas or countries where these species are protected, maybe even. And there were certain categories, particularly exotic pets and traditional medicine, which had particularly common usage of these broad codes. If we look a little bit closer at exotic pets, for example, the top 3 codes used are all just taxonomic class and above: ornamental fish, reptiles, and other birds. And that cumulatively is 95% of the trade declared in the pets category during this 20-year period. And that's obviously, there are many, many thousands of species of reptiles, songbirds, and fish. And unfortunately, there's only a few of them that are covered by CITES. So in the live reptile code, there could be anywhere up to 10,000 species of snakes, lizards, turtles, and crocodiles included. Only 10% of them are documented by CITES. And the same is true of songbirds. Only 10% of the thousands of songbird species are tracked through to species level by CITES. So 90% can be traded under this other birds code without any species level data. And only 162 species of fish are listed on CITES. If we also look at the traditional medicine category, we see that plants is used to declare 74% of the trade in this category. And the only 2 animal codes in this category include a broad range of wildlife. Ambergris is a whale derivative. This is a beaver derivative. It's also got civets thrown in there, bile and glands. And this code includes whales, tortoises, horns and antlers that could be from many different ungulates. And this, again, makes it difficult to detect if something is being overexploited. So our recommendations are that targeted resources such as money, personnel, training, and equipment are allocated strategically to the transit hubs that we've indicated, because that would give you the most bang for your buck, basically, a proportionally high impact relative to investment on global wildlife trade. There should be interdisciplinary research on legal global wildlife trade, including Comtrade database codes. And the findings of this research must be communicated with local and international authorities. So if you find that there are any particularly at-risk species or you develop any forensic tools that could help with species ID, this has to be, communicated to customs and so on. There should be a review of what species are traded under the very broad code descriptions, and these codes should be distilled down to at least family or genus level to just help us be able to trace and track how much is being traded and from where. And there should really be species-specific codes created, particularly in the areas that we indicate. So the exotic pets category, traditional medicine, timber traded as furniture, and fish traded as seafood, because these can involve many rare species, many of which are not listed on CITES, and many of which actually communities could benefit from if there was sustainable trade in these. So there would, of course, be challenges to implementing these changes, and the international community would really have to make a concerted effort to train stakeholders, whether that be customs officials or administrative bureaucrats and so on, to ensure that these declarations to either species level or the source information and volume and value are conducted with precision and accuracy. But the effort would most certainly be worth it. Implementing these high regulatory standards should really be afforded priority, given the role of species overexploitation in wildlife trade to the decline that we see in biodiversity globally. So with that, I'd like to say thanks to the co-authors, including Tilly from HKU, Wilson from Traffic, and Dr. Bonebrake, Dr. Dingle, and Professor Dudgeon from the Conservation Forensics Lab at Hong Kong U. And with that, I'll take any questions.